Thank you, Julie, and good morning to all of you. As Julie indicated, this is the final session for our conference. I think you will agree with me that this has been a very thoughtful conference in which we've been able to dive deeply into the topics and really consider issues that sometimes on a daily basis we may not be able to do in our jobs. And as Julie mentioned, I'm Teresa Lubbers, and I'm the Indiana Commissioner for Higher Education. I promise you that this session will continue to challenge and inform you in the same manner as the others. Our focus, as you know from looking at your agenda today, is shared responsibility and accountability, looking at this from a state, a federal, and the institutional perspective as well. We held a similar session to this when we had our SHEEO meeting in Boise last month, and we found that it was very well received. And even though we have a slightly different panel today with Ted Mitchell joining us, we're going to look at some of the same topics, ones that you deal with every day, issues related to value, access, accountability, student success, all the kinds of topics that we've been talking about, but in particular, who owns each part of those? A lot of questions have come up. What is value? How do we measure it? Who collects the data? How do we use the data? Who's responsible for ensuring value? What does value even mean? And so we've really asked our panelists today to look at this and then to consider what is the appropriate role in these questions and answering these questions for the federal government, for our states, and for the institutions. As we look at this morning, we're going to ask them to share their perspectives, and we're not going to spend as much time with the presentations as we have with some of the other sessions because we really want this to be interactive. We want to give you plenty of time to think about your questions, so please know as they're speaking that there will probably be at least 20 minutes for questions as well. They'll be speaking from their seats rather than coming to the podium. I'm not going to do long introductions. It's in your agenda book. Just to say briefly that we have joining us today, and we're delighted to have the Undersecretary for the U.S. Department of Education, Ted Mitchell, who came in to share what is an ever-changing landscape in Washington, D.C. that affects us in our states as well, and certainly affects student success, sharing with us his perspective, the President's perspective, and what we need to know. And then following Ted, we'll ask our president of SHEEO, George Pernsteiner, to share some thoughts about value at the state level, how we ensure this for our citizens, and what difference that makes to our states through the lens of student success again, which George does so well. And then Debra Humphreys from AAC&U, who was with us on the panel before and did a stellar job, is with us again today, always reminding us of the importance of quality and what our institutions are doing to ensure value as well. So with that, I will turn it over immediately to Ted Mitchell to share with us his perspective from the federal government and U.S. DOE.
Great. Thanks, Teresa, and thanks to all of you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be with you, pleasure to be a part of the conference, and a pleasure to be able to thank you for the incredibly hard and effective work that you do on a daily basis. We are going to talk about partnerships, and we're going to talk about how we can work together, but I want you to know as the new kid on the block that I particularly look forward to working with you over the next several years as we continue the work that you've started, that this administration has started, and really try to get a lot done. On that theme, I think that you talked a lot about equity yesterday, and I think I owe you one or two sentences of what brings me to this work. I've been in and around education work for 35 years, and there's been one through line in that travel. And that's been my attempt in a variety of different places to really make the American educational system equitable for all students and of high value for all students. And whether it was my time as a college professor, my time as a pseudo-venture capitalist trying to bring technology to bear on these problems, or as my time as a policymaker, first in California and now in Washington, the issues of equity have been at the center of my work. They're also clearly at the center of the President's agenda, And I think it's that match that gave him the idea of inviting me to join the administration, and is certainly why I took him up on the offer. Ours is an equity agenda, but it's not just an equity agenda. It's an equity agenda that drives, as Teresa mentioned a moment ago, toward high value for all students. To get there, you have to have access. The access has to be to affordable institutions. Those institutions, policymakers, and students need to be focused on completion. And if we do all of that right, we've got a running start on creating an equitable system of value in higher education. And as you all know better than I, higher education has never been more important. It's never been more important in the macro economy. It's never been more important in the micro economy of students' and families' lives. And it's, I'd argue, never been more important in the creation of a healthy civil society and a robust democracy. So that's, I think, what gets all of us in the department up in the morning. And I know that it is a large part of what gets you up in the morning as well. As Teresa mentioned, we're going to have a discussion and then invite you to join. So rather than go into, at this point, the 25-minute stump speech on the administration's priorities, which I might lapse into, and Teresa will slap me if I do, I want to sort of go from the questions of big strategy around access, affordability, outcomes, and value, and come down a level to talk about what that means in the Office of the Undersecretary, kind of on a day-to-day basis. And here I'm going to talk topic headings, and we'll dive into them in our conversation. I think of our work really as falling into three thematic buckets. One bucket is around transparency, one bucket is around accountability, and the third bucket is around innovation. And the activities that we're engaged in those three buckets, we hope and believe contribute to the broad access, affordability, outcome, and completion and outcome agenda. But let me mention a couple. So in transparency, Teresa talked about data. We know in the department, and you know in the states, that we're at this very interesting inflection point as we move to thinking about higher education from a system defined by inputs to one defined by outcomes. And as we make that move, the only way we can actually track program improvement, policy effectiveness, or institutional effectiveness is by the collection of good, reliable data. We're all struggling with it. It's one of the things that I hope we can talk about doing together. We have a number of long-tailed data streams, IPEDS being the clearest. We're working hard to try to get into the guts of IPEDS and make it more valuable to institutions and to policymakers by tackling some of the difficulties that we know it has. First time, full time would be the poster child for that. So we're hard at work and trying to deliver a more comprehensible, more reliable data system. That is all, of course, until we get the student record data system that we all know we need and want. And I am now starting to talk publicly about that again, and hope that I can count on your support. Also, in terms of transparency, we know that we need to make the work that we do more transparent to students and families. And here I think the whipping boy, if not poster child, is FAFSA. And so we've done some pretty radical simplification of FAFSA already. It's on our agenda to continue to do that over time. But we want to be sure as we do that we're not crossing wires with you in terms of eliminating things on FAFSA that you need to be making important determinations. And then finally, in the area of transparency, I know that many of you are working on a topic near and dear to our heart and my heart, which is making credit transfer a more transparent and reliable process for students so that we can really begin to tackle some of the developmental and remedial education issues that impact college access and completion. In terms of accountability, I think you might have heard that we're interested in producing a college rating system. If you haven't, we are. And Jamie, when she was in Boise, I know talked about our progress, and our progress is really being made by conversations with you and with institution leaders. I think we put out a big question about what ratings should look like. We've gotten a lot of very helpful suggestions, and we're aiming at a first draft of the ratings system, a first draft that will be something that people can actually talk about with some data. With some information in the late fall. I think that when we talk about accountability, in addition to the work that you do and the work that we do and the work that institutions do, we're very interested in the department in thinking through the role of accreditors and accrediting agencies and making sure that as we are working with accreditors, we're helping them achieve the right balance between quality assurance and innovation. And so that work is very important to us and will continue. Aligned with that are regulations that we're working on that you've been quite helpful with on state authorization. And two other bits of accountability. The other is that the Secretary is increasingly concerned about the continued disinvestment by states in higher education that really does run crosswise to the access and affordability agenda that he and the President and I have. And so we are looking for opportunities to work with you to encourage state legislatures and governors to be more active in supporting increased allocations to higher education, whether that's in performance-based states or other states. We think that the balance between the state investment, the federal investment, and the student and family investment has been skewed since the Great Recession, and we'd like to do all we can with you to restore an appropriate balance. And then finally, in talking about accountability, I want to point the mirror back at us and say that we need to find ways to be more accountable to our clients, to the states, to the institutions, and where we interact directly with students, to students and families. And this means opening and keeping open lines of communication around important policy issues and us being helpful to you, not just with national policy issues, but with state policy issues. I'll wrap up very quickly in talking about the innovation agenda. I don't think that you lower costs. I don't think that you increase access. I don't think that you increase completion rates by simply doing the same things over and over again. And so we're quite interested in looking for ways to incent innovation in the work that we do and through us in the work that you do. The ideas that we have so far are three. One is that we'd like to go through our own sets of regulations and see which of those are in the way of substantial state-level innovation. Second is a set of grant programs. First in the World is a grant program that just closed, $75 million program, overwhelming interest among institutions, 500 applications for what are likely to be 29 to 30 grants. We're going to do it again next year. We think that that's a good way to start. We've been speaking with some of you about experimental sites, ways for us to experiment with the distribution of financial aid in ways that will support competency-based learning and credentialing. We think that those programs as well will be important. And then the last piece, and you know it's been in our budget for the last 4 years, is a $4 billion program that we will propose again in the President's budget to create funds aimed at states to provide incentives to state governments to increase the level of funding, distribute it differently, to basically create a bucket of money that will be available to states to encourage state-level innovation. So we will work on all of those, but we cannot get any of this done without you. I've probably gone on longer than I wanted to, but I'm going to stop and turn it over to George.
Thank you. I think that provided a great overview for us to begin. And now, George, if you obviously can respond to anything that Ted said, but also in particular, if you'll pick up the mantle to talk about the state's role in ensuring value and how we make sure that the the citizens of our states and our state economies are better served.
Thanks, Teresa, and thank you, Mr. Undersecretary, or Ted.
Or Ted. Thank you.
Which are one of the same, I guess. So that's good. We heard yesterday from Suzanne Mettler that from the dawn of the Republic, the federal government has been a partner with the states in investing in and supporting higher education. The Northwest Ordinance was her example. We all could use other examples throughout time that have shown that there's been a partnership between the national government and the state governments. Under the Constitution, of course, education is a state responsibility, and our states, all of them, have supported higher education with regard to both authorization in terms of quality assurance and also in terms of funding of both students in terms of financial aid and institutions in order to provide capacity. And that's been true really ever since the University of North Carolina was founded and funded in 1792. That has not changed. It is a state responsibility to educate the citizens of its state. Over time, as we all know, the federal government has established policies and provided incentives and funding to have states advance those policies. Most famously, really, is the GI Bill at the end of World War II and the Morrill Act during the midst of the Civil War, both of which really enabled, in the first case, students, and in the second case, institutions, to advance the education of the nation. It's followed up throughout the period of the second half of the 20th century with investments from the federal government for everything from the National Defense Education Act to the Pell Grants to other things that have been used over time by the national government to say to the states, partner with us, because it is in our interest and yours to improve the education level of as many people in this country as possible. The grand experiment of the United States of democratizing higher education, which began really in earnest with the Morrill Act but continued apace with the GI Bill, we ain't seen nothing yet. 37 of our states have now adopted goals for increasing substantially the education attainment level of their citizens. That's 3/4 of the states. That's enough to amend the Constitution, in case anybody's wondering. They have adopted those goals because they recognize the vital importance of an educated citizenry. You notice I didn't just say an educated workforce, because from the dawn of the Republic also, the main underpinning of the philosophy for public higher education and all of higher education has been the advancement of citizens. As we look then to the future, we look at a situation that most of you know better than I. The vast majority of the students whom we will have to educate to meet those goals do not have the financial resources that a prior generation of students had. So we have to educate more students, educate them to a higher level and a higher standard because that is the demand of a 21st century global society, but educate them in a way that is less costly to them than what has evolved over the past 20 years, because the students of the future cannot afford to pay the costs that we will charge them. So as we look at that situation, we look back at the partnership that has existed for ever since the Republic began between the national government and the state governments. And I think I would like to ask Ted Mitchell, really, what are the elements that you see of a partnership between the federal government and the state governments that would advance student success in the next decade?
Great question, George. A couple of ideas. So I do think that we both touched on it. I think that we have sort of walked our way through the history of the Republic to an understanding that the responsibility, if you will, for an undergraduate education ought to be shared by the federal government in thinking about the national interest in an educated citizenry, mobile workforce and things that aren't directly related to states. A state investment, because there is a whole set of state interests, and an individual investment. And I think while we have sort of stumbled to that, I would like us in the next several years to talk in more granular detail about what we think the right balance is between those three, and to establish some guardrails around that, so that if any one of the three participants is sort of out of line, we can self-correct. And as I mentioned, I think it's time for a self-correction, because I think that, in my mind, the states have had to make very tough choices over the last 6 or 7 years. And the result of some of those choices has been a disinvestment in higher education that's been a part of the reason that more of the burden has fallen on students and families who can themselves ill afford it, because they've been subject to the same economic buffeting that the states have. So that would be one, is a conscious conversation about what the right balance there is. Second is that we need the states' help. And by we, I'm not talking about the federal government, but the nation. I think we need the states' help in getting better ringtones available. I caught mine just in time, because the wolf whistle was about to just... that's my daughter's ringtone, so we'll have to see later what she has in mind for me. But second, we do need your help in helping to control the cost disease, and I think that the rubber meets the road in the relationship between states and state legislatures and the funding formulas tied to cost. And so I think that that's a place where you can help us not only in lowering cost, but in generating good ideas for how to do that. And then I think at the federal level, we need to come back across that barrier by helping to provide cross-state information and data on everything from student outcomes to ways of controlling cost and, importantly, price, and being able to look at this important issue of equity and disaggregate, so that we know, for example, what the net price of institutions is at various income levels for students, so that we can ask ourselves the hard question about whether we're truly serving the equity agenda. So those would be a couple of entering ideas.
Debra, we're going to turn to you now and ask you to respond to these comments, but in particular through the lens of the institutions and how they're responding to the call for greater accountability and increasing value. You use the term accelerating positive change, and we'd like to know what that means.
Great. Thank you, Teresa. And first, let me just say how honored I am to be on this panel with Undersecretary Mitchell, but also with Commissioner Lubbers and President Pernsteiner. And I want to take this opportunity to thank especially Teresa and George for the partnership that AAC&U has with each of them and with their teams, particularly on a lot of innovative work happening in Indiana, and the partnership we have with them through our LEAP initiative and with George's team and other states on the multi-state collaborative on learning outcomes assessment. We could not do it without a really robust partnership with state leaders, and they are exceptionally innovative leaders, and so I'm really honored to be on the panel with them and to thank them for that partnership. So I'm just going to say a couple of words and then pose a question or two to Undersecretary Mitchell. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how the institutional leaders that we work with in our membership see their own responsibilities in advancing student success and also being more transparent about what we're doing and what impact we're having on students in terms of their progress through our systems and institutions, their learning along the way, and also about postgraduate outcomes. And The perspective I bring is from the membership of AAC&U, and so I should remind everyone that we have about 1,300 members, and we're roughly half public, half private, and all different types. So everything from open access to your institutions to the most selective private institutions. And I think that I have 2 points to make, and then I want to ask a question. The first point is that as I have worked with our members over the past 20 years, and quite intensely, particularly on the assessment and accountability issues probably for the last 10 years, I would say that I feel like there is a real sea change going on among institutional leaders and practitioners in higher education. And there is a lot more serious attention being paid today in all the areas that Ted mentioned, the transparency issue, the accountability issue, and also the innovation issue. I actually think there's a lot more innovation going on in the teaching and learning area and in the assessment area than the public and even policymakers may be aware of. But as I talk to our institutional leaders, I think that we sense a very different willingness and understanding of how untransparent we have been and how we have to be more transparent, but we have to do it with very careful attention to the kind of data that we're sharing and how we're using that data. I think the multi-state collaborative on learning outcomes assessment is a very complicated and ambitious project, and it's a very innovative approach to assessment. It may not move as fast as I think the policy world would like it to move, but it's something that I think will present us with some new kinds of data about the assessment of student learning that'll move the needle on the learning question. The other point I want to make is that I think that I do sense among educational leaders that they absolutely understand the need to improve the data we have, and also how we share it and use it to help all of you, but also to help the public and students understand better what the value of a college education really needs to be, and also how to make good educational choices. But it won't surprise this audience or anyone on this panel that there is a lot of concern among institutional leaders about unintended consequences of the use of incomplete data or data that may tell one story that isn't in fact a very accurate story about the value of what institutions add to students' success. So with that in mind, yesterday we were all reminded in that wonderful presentation by Suzanne Mettler that we're not going to be able to change the public narrative and perception of higher education, which is not in the best shape right now, I'm sure everyone knows. And we're also not going to change the political environment and move the needle on the funding questions that both Ted and George have put on the table. If we aren't better at reminding Americans of something that is actually sort of uniquely American about American higher education, and that is that we've always thought about it and the investment we make in it as something that is investing in the public good that higher education institutions and systems provide, not just the individual economic return on investment for individual students, which is clearly there and which we will all continue to talk about, I'm sure, and institutional leaders talk about endlessly. But I think she's right that we ourselves have overemphasized, and I include myself in that category, overemphasized the individual return on investment in terms of earnings in particular, and underemphasize the broader public good that is higher education. And so my question to you, Undersecretary Mitchell, is if you agree with Suzanne's assessment that we all have to sort of shift the public narrative a little bit in order to help the public understand the importance of investing in higher education, I wonder if you could talk from your point of view about what specific data points or metrics you think are most important for higher ed institutions to be collecting and sharing, not only with the federal government but with students and states, in order to reposition the role of higher education as essential to both the public good and the future vitality of our economy and our democracy.
When's lunch?
You didn't think I was going to ask you an easy one, did you?
So I'm happy to throw some ideas out, but before I do, I want to be clear about what I'm not about to say. So what I'm not about to say is, here's what the rating system is going to look like.
Oh, come on, Ted, just go ahead and...
So I'm not. So I think that the hardest one, the hardest piece to get at is this question of outcome. And I think what we would all share would be a desire to not be reductionist in our measures of outcome. And so I would love students to be able to look at the range of outcomes that folks have enjoyed coming from an institution or a program. So that's not a metric, it's more like a map or more like a landscape analysis of if I go to this institution and if I major in this, what kinds of things do people do? And I think that and it's not just do, by the way, as in their employment, but who runs for Congress, who participates in what kinds of civic organizations. I think, and so I think that we're not going to be able to come up with a metric that measures those range of choices, because if you just think about it, it's so indeterminate. I'm not sure where you even find the central tendency in some of those measures. So if you look at my own, if you were to ask the question, what do double majors in history and economics from Stanford do? I don't even,
lots of different things.
Yeah, I don't even know where to start. So I think that's the hard one. But I do think, and that's on the consumer-facing side, I do think on the accountability side, whether it's at the state level or at the federal level, we need to know some basic things about whether institutions and programs are graduating students who can pay off their student loans and be productively employed. So one of the things we're working on in the department is the set of gainful employment regulations. And that's what we're trying to do in gainful employment, is ask this sort of basic accountability question. I think that there's a big distance between those two, and I want to make sure that we don't confuse them. And that's what I mean about not being reductionist. Now let me move to a couple of easier pieces. I think that states have established goals, and metrics against those goals, I think, are matters of discussion, deliberation. You've done a great job of building those. I think we're learning from those and trying to see if there are some of those sets of metrics that would be appropriate for us. But from the federal government's point of view, we're keenly interested about how institutions measure up, if you will, against the broad equity agenda that we have as a nation and have had for 200 years or maybe 75 years. And that includes how well are we all doing in moving low-income students through? How well are we doing in providing access at different income quartiles? How well are we doing in distributing degrees across different income groups? Are we able to reach out to first-generation students in a meaningful way on both access and completion? So I think that those would be some of the things that we ought to tackle.
Panelists, you have a couple minutes. You can respond to each other, and I'm going to hold to 20 minutes for questions. So any other response?
Yeah, I have a follow-up question on that. You had mentioned the data question in your opening remarks, and I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the discussions within the department about the data you currently have available versus the data we need, and what priorities you have for, or maybe how confident you are that you have adequate data to answer the most important questions that we've put on the table.
So this is it's probably the central part of the discussion that we're having about the ratings system and also about gainful employment. And we're trying, as we go through this, to be very humble about the character and the quality of the data we have, and therefore the limitations of any conclusions that we can draw about institutional performance, state performance, and student outcomes. And so we're very conscious, for example, of some of the limitations, including the first-time, full-time that I mentioned about iPads, which is sort of one of the more trivial examples, but one that we know we need to fix. We know that states quite frequently have much better longitudinal data systems than the federal government, and we'd love to figure out ways to work collaboratively. I think, George, that's another answer to your question, to work collaboratively with you on both the structure of those data and the sharing of them. There are problems, of course, when graduates move across state lines and sort of disappear from anyone's sight. Second ad for the single student unit record. And I think we're doing our best to look across data systems to which we have access and trying to put together a composite that is responsible to answer some of the questions that you posed.
Yeah, Ted, can I ask one follow-up question? I had a question. I was talking about the rating system with a reporter just yesterday at the Wall Street Journal, and he was a very informed reporter, and so he understood some of these data problems, actually. And he asked me a question that I couldn't answer, which was, can the federal government use the better data set that the National Student Clearinghouse owns, I guess, or is there some actual legal reason why the government couldn't use that for a rating system? I couldn't answer that question. I wasn't sure.
Neither are we.
Okay.
We're working on the question.
Yeah.
And one of the there would need to be a memorandum of understanding, probably a contract, to be able to do that. And we're not sure then if that becomes a sort of single source problem.
Right,
so there are some procurement issues.
Okay, that's what I expected.
They're sort of at the center of that problem.
Okay. George?
You've raised a couple times, Ted, the question of a unit record system. You've raised a couple times the question of the unit record system. I forgot that yesterday. You have to speak directly into this and almost lick the darn mic to get it right. And I guess there have been issues about privacy and confidentiality that have been raised in the past as militating against having such a system. What might be your response or that of the administration to those kinds of criticisms? Because if we're going to go in that direction, we're going to have to confront those issues again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we should do so forthrightly. I think that trying to ignore or pretend that there aren't significant privacy and security issues would be wrong-headed, because there are. But I would like to approach the conversation from the point of view of all of the things that we have learned and gotten better at between the last time we talked about it and now. And I think also, let's move to K-12 for a moment. I think that we've had at times a raucous conversation in the K-12 environment about these privacy and data issues. We've been able, as a community, to come up with standards for how to use and not use personally identifiable information in the K-12 environment. And I think we can learn from that discussion and from partners who have been really advocacy partners who've been quite vigilant about this. And we need to, if we're going to do this, we need to do it right, and we need to build a system that has integrity, security built in from day one.
Okay, it's your turn. If you want to start coming to the mic, I will see how we do with questions. All right.
Thank you, Undersecretary Mitchell. That was I think that you've answered honestly and directly, and I've appreciated the questions that were raised too, but I have a couple myself. One has to do with need-based aid. We know from Dr. Finney's report yesterday that once we hit the recession, many states could not protect this, and also it moved to merit-based. What this means, and I'm from Utah, what this means in Utah is that you have the middle-class kids getting aid and the low-income not. So in this bucket of money that you're planning to use to support education in the states, I'm wondering how you can approach states that have moved from need-based to metric of merit. Okay, that's one. The other is I'm not quite sure what you mean by value. That as you spoke, I was thinking that you were tying the job directly to the income. And some of our areas in the social sciences and humanities and fine arts, not so much the fine arts, do not lead directly, but the skills that students learn, that our graduates will have, are those that we get constantly from business and industry. These are the skills we need, and those are the skills they have. So we may have a slightly different sense of value. So would you speak to that as well? Thank you.
Sure. So on the first one, I think that George mentioned that we have constitutionally left education to the states, and that's good and appropriate. So I think the reductionist answer, having said I don't like reductionist answers, is that states will continue to make the decisions that they believe are right for their populations. We do, as an administration, have an interest in making sure that students with financial need get aid, and so my guess is that in the program that we're proposing in the budget, that we will create incentives for states to move more of their money into the need-based category and less into the merit-based category. But that's but I am speculating. I will say that I would certainly support that. On the second question about value, I meant to agree with you, and so if I didn't, I apologize. So I think value is very complicated, and that's where I started. I think it's short term and long term. It is employment and civic life. It has a number of different variables inside the question of value. And I think we as leaders in higher education need to be sensitive to all of those. That's part one. Part two, the point that you raised about what employers want is also changing. And I think that that's the second place, at least, where we're seeing a sea change. If one is about data, I think the other is about really looking at the competencies that are required in a global, digital, highly mobile environment in which people change jobs, invent careers in whole enterprises over the course of what used to be a pretty stable employment setting. And the skills one needs for that are probably, and I used to, this was my talk to the Occidental alumni, is that the skills that are present in a rigorous, broad undergraduate program are those skills. Please.
Thank you. Good morning. I appreciate all the perspectives of the panel, and I especially appreciate what you have said, Mr. Undersecretary, about wanting to be partners with higher education. I have to admit, though, that I am concerned about some of the rhetoric of some of the folks that you work with and for, particularly around the rating system. There has been a lot of rhetoric that suggests that anytime higher education has any criticisms of it, it's mostly about trying to get what it really is a coded way of trying to get out from underneath it. There's probably some of that, but but I never hear that. But I don't hear people saying that there are in fact legitimate concerns about it. The most unfortunate use of rhetoric tries to compare, for instance, colleges to a single household kitchen appliance. Colleges do more than one thing. And so it's really not comparable. And I'm concerned that the department is looking to do something and to treat higher education less like a partner and more like a punching bag. And so I'm hoping that you can be reassuring about the ways that rhetoric doesn't really represent the spirit in which the rating system seems to be moving forward, and how there seems to be one conversation going on with higher education and another with the public.
We have, trying to find the right way in. There is no doubt that we have had great, good-spirited, intensely productive conversations with higher education over the last 6 months. And I'm grateful for those. And I think we probably have not been as grateful publicly for the input as we ought to be. So let me start. We're really grateful because we've gotten a lot smarter thanks to the input from individual researchers, institution leaders, system heads, you all. And I'm really looking forward to the time when we can talk about a draft of the rating system instead of a ghost that I think comes from some people's fears, some people's hopes, and I think the abstract nature of it has not helped us really have the back and forth that I hope we'll have in the coming months. I want to go back to one of the things. So let me also say, I do believe that there are institutions and institution leaders who would just as soon the whole thing go away, right? And it makes life easier. But I think the truth is that whether it's our narrative or the narrative with the public, we are in a position now as a nation where we are going to be held accountable. And we're going to be held accountable for things that we believe are the right things to be held accountable for, or we're going to be held accountable for things that somebody really does to us. We'd like the rating system to not be something that's done to you, but something that we agree as a community are the shared accountability metrics to which we want to hold ourselves accountable, to which we believe are the right metrics to hold ourselves accountable to, and which then ought to generate some questions at the high end of the distribution and the low end of the distribution. On the high end, wow, look at those institutions. What are they doing that I can learn from? And at the low end of the institution, to be able to say, look, we agreed on these measures. This isn't okay. And to then have appropriate conversations with those two buckets of folks. That's where we'd like to end up. The progress that we've made has been good and strong and based on our conversations with institutions. I will say one other thing to connect the first question George asked and Debra's point about innovation. I think that one of the ways the federal government can help states and institutions is by shining a spotlight on institutions doing great things. And I think we ought to pay more attention to catching institutions and states doing incredibly good things, because I think that's we owe you that. So I hope that's helpful.
Could you preface your questions or comments with your name and your state, please?
Sure, thank you. Bob Bruce, State of Oregon. Thank you for being here, the entire panel. Mr. Undersecretary, this may sound like a nuts and bolts question, but it really gets to your issues of accountability, transparency, diversity, and equity. Currently, the FAFSA has always been an important tool to ensure access and equity across higher education. And it's usually been part of the front door. Now with the FAFSA completion project and the data sharing agreements, it really becomes the front door. It's the first step towards getting students to consider higher education. It's also the FAFSA is also the application for virtually all of the state's need-based grants across the United States. It's an critically important tool. Unfortunately, the FAFSA contains no information about race and ethnicity. So we're limited to understanding who enters college only after they matriculate. We don't have any information about who's filing the FAFSA in the beginning and who we're not serving. So as you consider tweaking the FAFSA, I hope you would consider adding some self-reported race and ethnicity data. I think it would help the states, and it would serve national interest as well.
Great, thank you.
Hi, Bridget Burns, and I facilitate the University Innovation Alliance, so I theoretically work in 11 states. And my question is about the innovation, your third bucket that you talked about, the $4 million. I work with the 11 institutions that are really into experimentation, especially to help low-income students, and one of them, UT Austin, is already doing some of this experimentation around financial aid policy. We put forward an experimental site proposal where we said, if we double down our effort on helping low-income students complete in 4 years, would you consider giving them access to that fifth year's Pell as loan repayment? And I don't think that's obviously going to happen this first round, right? But would you consider using some of that $4 billion for institutions that are interested in kind of in matching, not just states? Because I find that some institutions are a bit more willing to do kind of more inventive work, and some kind of support from the federal government to assist that and help better facilitate and incentivize that might be helpful.
It's a great suggestion. I think at the moment, the $4 billion is still a budget proposal, and call your congresspeople. They need to hear from you, and that one is actually directed at states. But what we're hoping to do is to use the first in the world facility that we have. And in subsequent competitions to make sure that we've created opportunities for institutions and consortia of institutions to do just what you guys are doing so well. And thank you for that terrific work, by the way.
Hello again, Barbara
Hi.
Gelman,
Yep.
Danley, Higher Learning Commission, so that's 19 states. I have a question and a suggestion. First of all, how can accreditation help you achieve your goals, the accreditors, the agencies, et cetera? And secondly, I know there's a lot written about the triad, but since we're new, I thought it might be very useful if we sat down with SHEEO, with the federal government, with the accrediting agencies, and do principles of operation about how we're going to work together to move the needle to help higher education.
We would love to do that. Shall we do it?
Yep.
Great.
Okay.
Done.
Thank you.
Done. And I think that and to the question part, I think that we have asked accreditors to do boatloads of things, and it would be terrific to have conversations with accreditors probably after we've figured out where the guardrails are around each part of the triad's role, to then see if there are ways that we can streamline and simplify what accreditors do and make that clear to the world as well as to the institutions that you serve.
Pearlie Boshi from the University of Hawaii. I have a pretty simple question. States have really been moving to try to better understand what our students are doing after they graduate. So using wage data to see what happens. But we're really hampered because the data is not complete. So I was wondering what your department is doing to help work with the Labor Department to get us better data. For example, including hours worked in the data, occupation in the data, which very few states have, as well as trying to get access, help the states get access to other states' data.
We'd like to work with you on all of those things, and are, I think, at the beginning of that effort, not even halfway through.
Charlie?
I'm Charlie Lenth. I'm a very impolite SHEEO staff person who always has questions. I, too, would like to dig down into that innovation bucket a little bit more and engage all of you in that, because my sense is that there is a good deal of change and in practice. Whether and it's driven by change in our student populations and individual student behavior. It's driven by innovative institutions. It's driven by faculty who want to change what they're doing. And I think part of the problem we face, not just at the state level, but certainly at the state and federal and institutional level, is that we operate with a lot of, I'll use a neutral adjective, legacy policies. That have, as we heard in our opening session, many unintended consequences, and they're hard to change. So my question, and Teresa, I would invite you to be part of this, because I think much of the progress you've made in Indiana is in fact due to the fact that you're making policy in different ways. It looks different, from more active engagement with the state legislature up front to achieving consensus and agreement with your institutions and how to implement things. So I would like to get your thoughts on how we work together to really bring change to the policies within which we work and which need to stimulate innovation and change rather than hold it back. Thank you.
You guys want to take a stab at it?
Well, since you called me out, I'll just make one comment without oversimplifying a very good question. I think that one of the ways that it's easier to do it at the state level is if you have a clear strategic plan and goals that everyone has had an opportunity to participate in developing, so that then when you get to the difficulty of implementing, you can at least go back to this agreed strategic plan and these goals that you have. That's enabled us to work with both the institutions and the legislature and our governor in spite of the difficulty of the task, that just from an Indiana perspective.
From an institutional perspective, I think that what I would encourage, especially policy leaders, to do is start from a different position than I often see them start from, and that is assuming that faculty refuse or do not want to change. There may be some of them like that, but I think there is a whole new generation of faculty coming into our institutions, and they very much want all of their students to succeed, and they're actually quite open to changes, not just changes in pedagogy, but changes in assessment and changes in how we measure progress and credits. And so I guess what I would say is that I think that our institutions and faculty in those institutions are more open to change than people think. And in some ways, our leaders, and I include our own institutional leaders, often I think are not ambitious enough, underestimate our capacity for change and our willingness for it. And what I don't know what the federal or state level people can do beyond that. There's lots they can do, I'm sure, but I think we hold ourselves back when we make an assumption that the faculty are the problem rather than the solution. Mm-mm.
My concern with policies and statutes and all the great panoply of legal framework that we've established over the years is that because it has been established piecemeal to meet the interests of one particular or two particular interest groups, it's very difficult to unravel it. It's very difficult to actually make sense of it. I think what you need to do is not be hampered by that, but creative interpretations within the framework you have is probably a better place to start than trying to change the actual rules and statutes. And I think that's where Indiana started. We want to go here. What's it going to take to get there? Not what are the things we can't do because of the framework. And I think that's what the experimental program that the department is talking about is really all about now. It's, okay, we know we have all these rules, but what can we still do in order to achieve the goal we want? And I don't know, Ted, if you want to...
Yeah, I get three really quick things. I think that I fundamentally agree with George, and I think that one of the things that we're very interested in is identifying some of the things that we can change. So within that knot of regulation, there are probably some things that we could take care of, and we need your help identifying them. I mean, we could try to invent them. There's a great task force of institutional leaders that Senators Alexander and Bennett have put together that is looking at these issues. We're working closely with them to try to look at that from the top down. But I think it's really where the rubber meets the road that you guys feel this. And when you find things, we'd love to try to fix them or say, no, probably can't get there. And in the meantime, so that's one thing. Second thing is that we do believe that we can lay some track for future policy through the experiments that we're doing, and are really eager to get people to do some out there things. And then finally, to connect to Debra's point, this First in the World program, $75 million grant program, 500 institutions raised their hand and said, we want to innovate. We want to do different things around the agenda that you've set out for us, around access and affordability and completion and strong outcomes. So for me, I agree. I think that there's enormous vitality, and if we can figure out ways of building, to Teresa's point, sort of collaborative ways of getting there, then I think that's the future for all of us.
Julie, may I allow 1 minute for a closing for each of the three? Okay, we're coming to a conclusion. The questions were great. I think it was a great conversation. Thank the panelists. I'll give each of you a minute to close to respond.
Well, I guess I would just say thank you to Undersecretary Mitchell. I think that it's fantastic that Congress finally got its act together to get you in place. We've been waiting a long time, as I know you have, and if this conversation is any indication, we look forward to really productive partnerships going forward. And I think our goals are the same, and we all recognize we have a long way to go in meeting particularly the equity imperative challenge that our nation faces. And all I'll say is that our membership and our institutions and our associations stand ready to partner on that issue in particular.
Thanks. Well, I would agree with everything that Debra said. I am eager to engage in a very active partnership with the department. I think the states are eager for that, and I think we want to start doing it now.
And I think we have. And it's just a privilege to be here with you, and what a terrific panel. I want to thank my panelists and Teresa for keeping us in good order. But this has been great. Thanks.